Newspapers start up, and they initially began as official propaganda sheets for the parties. They were owned by political parties, and newspaper publishers came to serve as the agents of party politicians who hired and fired them. This, combined with the initial instability of partisan politics during this time period, made for a bad business model because you can't have any sort of consistency. A great example of this was Andrew Jackson using newspapers as a patronage appointment, where loyalists were given jobs as reporters, and the previous regime was fired regardless of performance. I know it's probably hard to imagine a world where the parties run the media, but it's true. Seriously, despite the heavy partisan leanings of much of the media today and how they function as an unofficial wing of the party, the business end isn't actually controlled by the politicians. While this doesn't say much for the quality of news we get, at least it does give the businesses consistency. The next step is the rise of the penny presses, a cheaper market, mass production, and the goal of independent ownership. I was actually watching Shark Tank as I wrote this lecture, and one of the big things they talk about on that show is reducing costs by increasing the size of the market. Basically, the more newspapers you print, the cheaper the cost is per unit. But to do this, it wasn't necessarily anything other than time that limited them, so they needed an improvement in the technology, which was brought on by the steam-powered printing press. This press was quicker, required less human labor, so they could print more papers more quickly, and began the mass market. The first two papers to adopt these innovations were the New York Sun and the New York Herald, while other papers still sold limited edition volumes for 6 cents each. Think about that gap for a minute, 1 cent versus 6 cents. Today that's equivalent of selling a daily paper for about 75 cents compared to selling one for $4.50. People might pay 75 cents for a newspaper, but no one's certainly going to pay $4.50 for a daily newspaper. Those cost differences became huge. During this time, we also started to see a shift in what was covered and what was considered news. We began covering more human interest stories, more coverage of crime stories, business and social events. And this represents most of what we see today. And it's interesting to note that the market hasn't really changed. Regular readers of the New York Times might know that the wedding announcements make up a significant portion of the paper. And by significant, I mean like a page or two, but still. These sorts of things, social events, arts and leisure, sporting events, local stories in most newspapers, this is what they cover, especially compared to national news. The Fredericksburg Freelance Star covers the latest in business happenings, things like that, rather than national news, because that's where they have their advantage for the most part. Around this time, we also saw the creation of the Associated Press. You've seen the AP byline or header on news stories, but maybe you haven't thought about what it is. Normal papers don't have the resources to have reporters in Washington, D.C., every state capital, plus all the major cities in each state, every major sporting event, every country across the world, etc., but they still want to cover these stories. So the Fredericksburg Freelance Star we talked about may want to cover a national news story, but doesn't have a reporter even in D.C. to think about it. So, news outlets subscribe to the Associated Press because the AP actually does have the resources to do this, and they write up the stories, sell them to a number of different papers across the country. You give them credit, you can modify it a little bit, life is good. This makes it easier for newspapers to cover stories, and the AP was once again able to depend on an economy of scale to provide this service. The next thing is the beginning of newspaper monopolies across the world. We see Hearst and Pulitzer beginning to either buy newspapers in different markets or start their own across the world. This gives these two publishing magnates tremendous control over the market and the news itself. Think about the idea that only 2 people were able to decide what news basically everyone on the planet got to see, and how that affects the newspaper's role as a civic educator. If these 2 men aren't benevolent dictators willing to share positive, good, useful information, and they're not, spoiler alert, they could easily alter people's perceptions based on different framing of stories or even flat out lying. Fake news, as the youth say. This is one of the big reasons we see FCC rules on how many news organizations one person can own today. Diversity in news ownership at least potentially creates some sort of accountability through the market.